So my name's Steve Clark. I'm an optometrist. I work for the Outside Clinic and I also work for NHS England, and I'm going to be talking about the legal aspects of home visiting eye care, domiciliary eye care. So the people that qualify on the NHS for a home visit eye test are people that are unable to attend a local practice unaccompanied. So quite a lot of people that we see are able to attend a local practice if they were supported by their son or daughter, and they may choose to do that, or they may choose to have a home visit. Then we see a subgroup of people that absolutely cannot get out of their house and are truly, absolutely housebound. And they're obviously entitled to NHS care. It's very rare, but I suppose they also have to be NHS exempt as well. So if they were under 60, for instance, and they had financial means, then they wouldn't be in a GOS group, and then they can't have an NHS sight test either. But that almost never happens. It's, virtually everybody we see is over 60. So regardless of income, they would get an NHS sight test. So a GOS6 form is a home visit version of the one that you use on the high street. Obviously everybody's gone to PCSE and electronic submissions now, so really you don't notice it apart from the number that changes at the top. The exemption groups are exactly the same. The big difference is that there's a line in there that says what's the main medical reason that stops somebody attending a practice unaccompanied. And the patient needs to give that information. So if they say they've had a stroke, or they say they've got anxiety and agoraphobia and can't go out, or they've got arthritis, that's what we put down on that form. The GOS regulations say, technically they say that there's an illness that causes somebody, but in legal terms the phrase illness actually means mental or physical disability that stops somebody from getting out. So it could be that somebody's paraplegic, it could be that somebody's got agoraphobia and just is very, very anxious and can't go out. So either people just won't access eye care unless the NHS fund a home visit for them. So we have to put a medical reason down. So just being wobbly on your feet is not an acceptable reason for the NHS. But if they've got a medical condition that's being diagnosed, that is the reason. So we see a lot of people with Parkinson's. We see a few people, probably more than a few people with strokes. Quite a lot of people with arthritis. Quite a lot of spinal scoliosis. People are bent over a little bit, and that can be interesting from a dispensing point of view because their varifocals sit in a different position. The regulations in England and Wales say that we have to give notifications. They are in Scotland, but they're slightly different in Scotland. But in England and Wales, you have to give 48 hours notice of doing an NHS sight test for somebody through PCSE's online system. So it's relatively, it's a back office function. So as a working optometrist, I don't get involved in that. But if somebody phones up and says, I want to be seen tomorrow, the NHS regulations currently don't allow us to go out and bill that to the NHS. So that's the criteria for going and seeing somebody. If you see somebody in groups of 3 or more, and some of our colleagues that go to nursing homes do see 3 or more, then you have to give 3 weeks notice. You are allowed to substitute if there's a problem. So if a care home, for instance, has an outbreak of norovirus or something, then you're allowed to substitute that home for another visit that you've also notified for. But in home visits, that's quite unusual. But we do get a fair number of people that are taken into hospital during the day or a couple of days before. So we do have to chop and change and be flexible, but our head office sort out what we're going to do next if we've got a gap. If you've notified under the regulations that you've given the NHS 48 hours notice that you're going to go and see somebody, you are allowed to substitute additional people in up to a maximum of 3. That sometimes happens if you go and see, Mr. Smith and his wife also has a disability and can't get out, and she says, well, I love what you've just done for my husband, but before you pack your bags, could you see me as well? So that is a possibility. It's got to be balanced with the fact that if you spend that additional time, you might not be able to see the last person that you were due to see at the end of the day. So we normally take advice from our head office as to whether that we come back at a later date and see those people. But it is allowable under the regulations. With DBS checks, we make sure all our practitioners are checked and we join the online update as well. So our head office have access on an ongoing basis to the DBS checks. It's not actually a regulatory requirement for domiciliary, but of course we work with vulnerable adults. So, we want to care for them properly and we want to have all the safety mechanisms in that we can. So that's part of our normal systems. The Mental Capacity Act really, as I think most practitioners know, is really saying that we have to presume that everybody has the capacity to make their own informed decisions and give consent until they prove to us that they can't. So certainly we find in domiciliary care that often mum or dad has a little bit of dementia and a very caring son or daughter goes, actually I'll answer these questions for my dad. But when you get to things like, do you get flashing lights? Only dad can answer that question. So, the Mental Capacity Act really says you've got to assume he's capable of answering that and giving consent for you doing eye care or dilation or whatever else it is that you're recommending, unless he shows that he's not capable of that. Record keeping is really important in domiciliary. I think much more, it's important in the profession and all medical professions, but it's really important in our particular world because we get a lot of really caring sons and daughters that phone us up and say, look, thanks ever so much for looking after my dad. And, he says that you've referred him off to his GP, but he's not sure what for. Could you tell us why? Or I was surprised at the fact that he ordered new glasses, or can you explain the price of the glasses? All of which are completely legitimate questions. If that was my dad, I'd be asking those questions. But of course what the law says is everything we talk about with our patients is confidential unless they've given consent for that to be disclosed, or that other person shows us their power of attorney, which can be done, but it's quite blocky. It's quite difficult to share all of that. You've got to send emails and so on. So what we do at the end of every test for everybody is ask them if they wish to consent for us to disclose their eye information to close members of their family or anybody else that they specify. And usually they're quite happy with that. Occasionally they're not, and that's fine. We record that they're not happy and we will not disclose that information. Referrals are really interesting, and it's personally one of the things that I really like about home visits, that there's a whole conversation to be had about whether somebody wishes to be referred. So when I used to work in practice, if you saw a pathology, you would just say to somebody, well, you've got this pathology and this is the reason why you need to be seen, and everybody would go. But it's really important to discuss that holistically with somebody in a home visit. If somebody's very elderly, it's going to be really painful to physically get in even an ambulance to get them to the hospital to be assessed. They may choose not to be assessed for the condition that you've identified, and that's absolutely fine. But the challenge then is it's got to be informed consent. So you've got to have a proper conversation with people about what the consequences of not referring are. But equally the other way around, what are the consequences of referring? So we have quite a long conversation about wet AMD referrals because, there is no known treatment apart from an injection inside your eye and regular scanning. So if that was me, I would go to the hospital and be regularly scanned, and I would happily, let somebody inject inside my eye. But if I was 95 and I was on palliative care and I had good sight in the other eye, I might choose that actually, I don't want to go to the hospital every 6 weeks. Professionally, the important thing is to discuss that with them, give them all the information, let them choose. And then from a record keeping point of view, make sure we write it all down. Because, it's important the following practitioner knows that A, we identified it, B, we discussed it, and C, they decided they didn't want to go. Working on my own and going into an address that I've not been to before was a concern for me before I joined domiciliary. Certainly there are several reasons why it's not a concern, having done it for 18 years. The first one is we have a lot of contact with our patients before we go and see them. So our head office has phoned them several times to arrange the appointment. I speak to them an hour beforehand. So there's actually quite a lot of contact. It's not like randomly knocking on somebody's door. And that helps the vulnerable adult as well, because actually they're sitting there thinking, well, I don't know who this person is that's coming to see us. So it reassures both parties. I have to say, in 18 years of doing home visits, I've never felt in any way threatened, in a home visit environment. I've seen a few things that can be challenging, that keep the day different to other days. You see some social situations sometimes which are a little surprising, and take a little bit of taking in before you decide how you're going to go forward, but not ones that threaten me from a personal point of view. We also have a good reporting structure as well. I can remember a few years ago now arriving at a lady, and I'd phoned her son, so I don't quite know why her son wasn't there, but she was there on her own in the house, and she had quite advanced dementia. And as I opened the front door, she was coming down the stairs completely naked. And so I just closed the front door, wrote an incident report for the company, but also phoned the son and said, look, it's not appropriate for me to go even enter the house in that situation. We need to reschedule that when you're there to help and support your mother. But that's probably the only time I can think. And I didn't feel threatened, but I suppose I could have put myself in a vulnerable position if I hadn't acted quickly and in the right way. But that's our training and experience, really.